Yo, what is up, guys? Will here with Canyon with Fantasy Flock Basketball, and we're talking through some big name players who are dealing with injuries or injury concerns. It's just something that happens in NBA fantasy. Obviously, long seasons in the NBA, guys deal with injuries. There's injury risk players. You get players out for a significant amount of time, and it puts you in a tough spot. As a manager of those players, you're like, what do I do with these guys? Do I try to trade them? If you don't have these players, it's you think, is it a buy low opportunity? Is there a lot of risk? So we're going to talk through that with a lot of these guys. Real quick, though, just kind of general thoughts about injury risk players and injuries in general. In fantasy, I think as managers, we tend to overhype and overanalyze valuing individual players connected to other ones, right? Is this guy better than this guy? This guy's better than this guy. And if you don't think that way, you're wrong. And really, I tend to think of fantasy more in tiers. So there's a lot of players who are going to finish really close in fantasy points per game. Like, sure, one guy's going to be fifth and another guy has to be sixth. Somebody has to be better than the other player. But for the most part, fantasy production, it's not going to be super noticeable, those guys that finish neck and neck. So I think there's a lot of players in similar tiers. So like with injury risk players, I think in a lot of these situations, you shouldn't feel too awful if you're in a spot where you feel like you're getting the worst player if you think the production is going to be pretty close. So we're going to talk through some injury risk players. But real quick, we're not going to cover every single player that's dealing with injuries or has dealt with an injury. We're just going to go through some of the key names. And first off, probably one of the most frustrating for people this season, it's Lamell Ball, who dealt with the ankle injury, obviously, to start the season, came back and then re-aggravated the same ankle. And right now, there's no timetable for the return. And that's obviously really frustrating. With a lot of these injuries, we're able to see, hey, it's going to be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever. We know the rough timeline, but these unclear timetables, I think for me, I don't necessarily want to acquire players who don't have a clear timetable. I think it's just, it's a lot of risk you're incurring. Obviously, it's all going to be relative to the price of these players that you're trying to buy from other teams, buy low. But I think Lamell is one of those guys who, unfortunately, even though I really believe in the breakout, I'm just not willing to take on the risk for a guy who's re-aggravated an injury and we don't have a timetable for when he's coming back. And the thing is, if you're wrong about these guys, so if we make this video and next week Lamell is back and playing, you don't lose anything by not making that trade, right? So I think you just, avoiding the risk is something you want to do in NBA fantasy. And I think Lamell is one of those guys where you just kind of have to.
Yeah, it's most frustrating, I think, for LaMelo out of all guys on this list because of the unclear timetable. And, we'll talk about this this applies to all these injury guys, but just because you've held on to these guys, specifically like LaMelo, right, who's been out for a little bit already, doesn't mean that you have to hold on to him until he's back or, just go through with it, right? The sunk cost theory. You don't have to sit there and assume all of this absence and wait for him to finally be back and to reap those benefits. Like, you can let him go even if you had him on your IL for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, or some of these guys like that. So don't be afraid to, get rid of someone even if you've just been sitting with them for 2 weeks and haven't benefited from any trade like that. You can still make that move now, specifically for guys like Lamelo that are very unclear with their timetable. But next up here, I've got Karl Anthony Towns. Expected to miss about 4 to 6 weeks with that grade 3 calf strain. 4 to 6 weeks, honestly, not terrible. Grade 3, I think, is the worst in the calf strain department that we've seen from NBA players here. But his numbers are down apart from his assists regardless. I'm not even a big Cat guy. I don't think we were at the beginning of the year. Preseason, we talked about Cat's value maybe being a little too high, so I don't expect him to be a first-round player at the end of the year anyway. So Cat's a guy I would really look to move or shop around with league mates because 4 to 6 weeks isn't kind of as daunting of a timetable as some of these other guys that are unclear or have had even more injury history. And I think a move to, get rid of Cat, even if he was a first round value, to move him for, maybe a third or fourth round value guy or someone that's closer to him in fantasy points per game, just getting someone that can play immediately and potentially finish the season above Cat is a solid move. I think selling Cat low, if you will, right now, that scares a lot of people, right? Because you've been holding them for so long, all these guys, this injury, it's like, I can't sell them low. But sometimes you just have to make that move, like Will said, to make the safe play and not assume extra risk. So Cat's one of those guys that I actually am most worried about on this list.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, I think the production we've seen, I think Cat carries a lot of name value. I think a lot of people remember him as a late first round pick or a guy who's just consistently been in the first round. And if you just look at production, man, I mean, the scoring's been down like 4 points per game. Rebounding numbers have been down, I think like around 1.5 with Rudy, obviously. The assist numbers have been pretty good, but yeah, I mean, just the production he's had. And I think he's one of those guys where, yeah, like Kenny mentioned, I'm fine selling low. Next up here, pains me to bring up this guy, but Cade, man, the stress fracture, and I know we see these videos of him, shooting around a little bit, but there's talking about shutting him down for the season, potentially with if it requires surgery, even if they take the rest route. I really don't see a reason for them to rush Cade back. It really doesn't make sense with where the Pistons are at right now, what they're doing. A lot of the young core, I think Casey's going to be really willing to play those guys. I think for me, it would really surprise me if we saw Cade honestly at all this season. Definitely not before the All-Star break. I just really don't see that happening. Maybe if they take the rest route and he's feeling really good and there's no risk or concerns with re-injury, but he's the future of that team. It really does not make sense for them to rush him back. So I think as far as trading, if you have him, obviously I think he's worth a hold, right? Just to kind of see what the reports are going to be. But if people are inquiring about Cade, I mean, I'm fine trying to package him or move him, getting a player who, I mean, you're not going to be able to get a player who would put up the production Cade would put, obviously, with the injury. But if you can get yourself like a consistent starter, I'm fine with that because I really don't see a world where he's back anytime soon.
Yeah, this is a guy that best case scenario, he's back in 2 months. And that's a lot of fantasy matchups that you're missing out with a guy like Cade. So if anybody's inquiring about him, I have my ears open for sure. Next up here, we've got another very popular name, not only this year, but in previous years, Kawhi Leonard. He did just come back prior to this night of recording in the Orlando game in overtime. He played around 30 minutes in that game. Didn't play in this Heat game, I believe. We're recording at the same time of that. But he's being brought back into rotation, and he's seeing solid minutes. He's seeing high 20 minutes, 30 minutes, which is pretty encouraging. But he's already missed 20 games, right? And Kawhi is expected to play probably late 50s in games. He's already kind of pushing that ceiling of as many games as he can play. We're very willing to move Kawhi. Best case scenario, he's probably 70-75% of what you expected from him when you drafted him coming back. Maybe he does come back to kind of classic Kawhi late in the second half of the season, but at that point it might be a little late for your team, for the impact on your team. And other than that, this advantage healthy stretch that you can have here is, if he's coming back and he's playing 30 minutes next week and he plays 3 or 4 of the games that they have next week and he's playing 28 to 30 minutes and there's slow inklings of an incline and him getting better, this might be actually a really good window to move him because I don't think like we talked about earlier, I don't think it's worth keeping him. Like, what's the ceiling, what's the end goal with keeping Kawhi? I don't think he's going to be this win your league kind of guy at the end of the season, just with all these injuries and how he's been looking and how slow this progress has been. But if he is coming back, you could take advantage of your league mates, maybe some box score watchers, maybe some guys who aren't really keen to his injury history or the impact that it might have long term. I think this is a really good window to possibly move him in the next couple of weeks if he's playing more and producing at a solid level in those minutes.
Yeah, definitely. I know Kawhi's been really frustrating. We get a lot of questions in the live stream about, is Kawhi going to repay, the third round pick I took him? And I think that the answer is an astounding no, obviously. Right. And so obviously a lot of these injury questions with these players, it's all right, what are we doing moving forward with this? And I think Kawhi's one of those guys where, if I'm wrong on this and Kawhi, plays consistent in some department, I don't even think that's true, though. I don't even think that's a possibility. I think best case scenario, he's going to be, 80%, like I talked about, of what Kawhi's been from a production standpoint. And obviously he's had some pretty disappointing games. He's returning from the injuries, so you expect that pretty inefficient shooting and scoring. But yeah, I just think he's one of those guys where, like Kenny mentioned, man, if you get this healthy stretch, I'm really, really looking to move him for a consistent starter, for my fantasy teams, just because I really don't want to deal with the injury nightmare. So I think you can really, really try to move him if the opportunity shows itself, because, man, I mean, Kawhi, we've got leagues where people are dropping him straight up. And I think he has enough name value and he'll have decent games if he has this kind of healthy stretch where he's playing a couple games, during a week, where I think he'll be able to move him with the name value. Next up here, we've got Anthony Davis, who, obviously he's not dealing with a major injury right now, missed 2 games here with the illness, but man, he has been insane from a production standpoint. I think a lot of people would be surprised, but in points leagues, the scoring that we're looking at, I mean, he's outscoring Embiid right now in fantasy points per game. Just, the scoring's been crazy. The rebounding numbers have been insane. The defensive stats have been crazy. And the thing is, I don't think he'll be able to keep up the pace he's on right now. But honestly, the production he's giving, it's not really super surprising, right? Like we've seen Anthony Davis do this kind of stuff. Now, granted, a lot of this was, looking back at Pelicans numbers and everything, but obviously the scoring's been crazy in a lot of these games. But I think he can, replicate a decent amount of this kind of per game. But that's the question, right? Per game is kind of what you talk about with Anthony Davis, because there's just an expectation he's going to miss time. So I think the question kind of is with AD is, obviously he feels like a pretty strong sell high candidate, but that really depends on, your league's perceived value of AD, because I just told you he's outscoring Embiid, but I'm sorry, you're going to get laughed at if you send Anthony Davis for Embiid in any of your leagues. So I think you really have to take a look at, do you think you can flip AD for another first round value? Because right now he's giving you top end. He's giving you top 3 fantasy points per game scoring. So I think you might be able to, if he comes back and has a really strong game from the illness, you say, hey, AD, it was just, it wasn't a back, it wasn't a ACL or anything. He was just sick for a couple games. Look at the stretch he's just had. I would really look to sell him if you didn't already with that hot stretch. I think that would have been a really good move. But I think it's one of those things where it's like, hey, if AD has the healthiest season he's had for the Lakers in these past couple seasons, and you're wrong, but you were able to return with a first round value, like you're not going to be disappointed in that. Like even if he does outscore whoever you got back, I think just eliminating risk is something you really want to do in fantasy basketball, like we've talked about. I think AD is one of those guys where, especially with this stretch, you can eliminate risk and still get really good return.
Yeah, I mean, before the season started, if you have AD and, we told you he'd be averaging 27-12 with insane defensive stats and playing 21 games already at this point of the season, you would have been like, holy cow, I will take that. Like, you're living in the glory days here, right? So selling high is a very viable option. Like you said, if you get him for a first round value or a couple of like really solid players, I don't think you'd be kicking yourself if AD ends up playing like over 60 games for the first time in 4 years. Next up here, we've got a kind of little different twist on this. We've got Robert Williams. So this is a guy that's obviously been injured all year and might come back here soon for the first time this season. So guys like Robert Williams, guys that have been out all the start of the season that might be coming back soon, like Alonzo in the future or what have you. But specifically for Robert Williams, he could be back in 10 to 12 days. So, around 2 weeks here, a guy like Robert Williams, who obviously he'll be, slowly integrated into the offense and into the rotation most likely. And this is a guy that, tail end of last year, he was an absolute monster when he saw the minutes, rebounding and points upside and defensive upside as well. And, Al Horford has assumed a lot of those minutes. And it's not because Al Horford is just all of a sudden going to be this monster this year. It's because, they have a clear absence at the center position behind Al Horford. So Robert Williams is really going to be needed in that team, and he should be integrated back and very quickly into this team. So make sure, most of you probably already have him on your ILs if you have IL spots, but just do a double check to see if for some reason someone in your league has dropped Robert Williams, or if he's just floating right there in the waivers. If you have an IL spot, grab him. Even if you don't have an IL spot, maybe you want to be the first one to get him, jump the gun, and try to grab him because he should be back here in 2 weeks.
Yeah, I love that call. I know a lot of people, a lot of these guys where they just go unnoticed, right? I mean, Robert Williams, you'll get the tweet from Shams and Woj, right, that he's, going to see the return in 10 to 12 days, but you can really get ahead of it in leagues that don't have IL spots where these guys just go unnoticed because they're not going to show up in, the fantasy points per game or anything if people are filtering by that in their waivers and everything. But I think he's a guy who, I'm expecting when he does return and is playing decent minutes, which I think he can, because I don't think they want Al Horford to be playing as many minutes as he has. That was kind of a thing at the end of last season. There were reports that Horford was, even going to play fewer minutes than he did last season, and he's beating that by a significant amount at this point. So I do like Time Lord. Last up here, a guy we're going to talk about, and a couple guys, but right here, DeJounte Murray, who had the left ankle sprain injury just in this past game the other night. It's looking like 2 weeks for the return. I like Murray a lot. I think he'll be strong when he returns. He's getting a lot of on-ball usage for that Hawks team, playing really well, obviously. Doing a lot of the same stuff he did for the Spurs last season. I think we expected a lot of Trae Young usage, which obviously he's still getting a decent amount, but Murray's got a decent amount as well. I do want to call out for these kind of tight timetables for these injuries that are, it's going to be a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. We know exactly what's going to be. And you don't feel super afraid of like re-injury risk with some of these. So I do want to call out real quick. We're not doctors, okay? We're not going to pretend that we know exactly, the percentage injury, re-injury, re-aggravation risk for all these players. But I think injuries in general, if you do have these small timetables that, players are coming back and, they're feeling good and you don't have a ton of fear of re-injury. Obviously, there's different kind of injuries, right? Concussion or, an eye injury that Darius Garland had earlier in the season. Those are different than like an ankle or something, but I think in general, I do want to call out for these kind of tight timetables that it's really short time, 1, 2, 3 weeks, like Maxi's returning, Desmond Bane's going to be out for a couple weeks. I think these are guys you just want to do a little price check if you don't have these guys on your rosters, because these are guys we like a lot, specifically Bane, Maxey, and Murray, who've had a really strong start to the season. And I think when you get guys that are going to be out for 2 to 3 weeks, doing a little price check and seeing how low you can buy these guys for. Just send an offer that you would be ecstatic if you got those guys, even though they're currently injured. Just because fantasy basketball, it's a long game. It feels like, basketball has been back for a while, but we still got a long ways to go for the full season. So if you're only missing 1 to 2 weeks on some of these guys, it might really hurt you for the next 2 matchups. But man, from that point on, if you're able to buy low on these guys that are currently injured because, people were panicked because they're, missing a guy who's been giving them good production and they don't want to get behind in the league, I think you can really take advantage. So I think these kind of tight timetables, I think it's good to kind of just do a little price check. So that was, I just want to talk through some of those injuries. Let us know your thoughts if you guys disagree with some of our takes. If you don't think, 80s is sell high, or you're trying to get Lamell everywhere. We'd love to hear you guys' opinions. We do like checking that out in the comments. Let us know if you have any questions. Appreciate you guys watching. We'll see you in the next one.